add on to what both Martin and the minister has said, and I would like to say, I just don't think you can have an energy transition without having a just transition. Because if you think about what the minister has just said, she has pointed out that all of the nations, the small island nations, the developing countries that have experienced the brunt of climate change, are not the ones that have done the emitting. And you can see this in a more microcosmic way within single countries themselves. So look at the US. There are low-income communities that cannot afford except to live next to the polluting power plant or next to the polluting airport or what have you, or in the floodplains. And they're not the ones that are using all of the energy that is emitting all the carbon that is causing our crisis. And so when you think about a fast transition, the question is a fast transition for whom? You can't, if you don't bring everybody along, I question whether we have really succeeded in having any kind of energy transition. And so then to the point of adaptation versus mitigation, I think that because the developed world, having faced fewer of the brunt of the impact, less of the brunt of the impact than the developing world, we've been focusing mostly on mitigation because that's what we see. We don't want to face these impacts in the future, and even though we are facing some now, our focus has been on the mitigation piece. The adaptation piece is more important to the developing world because, I mentioned the example of Pakistan, right? That's here, that's happening now, and that's not just there, it's happening all over the developing world. The reason that the private sector could pay attention to and should pay attention to adaptation is, and specifically adaptation in developing countries, is that that's where the financing is right now. The minister mentioned the pledge. There's $100 billion that was supposed to have been pledged from developed countries to developing countries, much of that for adaptation. And I wrote an article in which I made the case that there's a $2 trillion market here in adaptation, and much of that is currently in developing countries. And I think that's the best case you can make for it. But where I think this actually breaks down, if I'm being truthful, is if you follow the money in the long term, the opportunity right now is in the developing countries. In the long term, the money is really going to flow still towards the developed countries, and we still now have this inequity. It's going to be much more lucrative to develop adaptation solutions to protect, for example, very expensive real estate, and that's going to be in developed countries. Or it's going to be more lucrative to protect big data centers also in developed countries. And so what I've really been thinking about and keep coming back to is this question of, are we using the right tools to solve the climate crisis? And if you think about all the tools we've been talking financing, we talk the language of investment, we talk the language of creating new markets. These are all the tools of capitalism. And I wonder whether these are the right tools to be using, because if you think about what created the climate crisis, it is fundamentally capitalism. It's the need for growth, which fuels the need for production, which fuels the need for extraction. And this need for extraction is what has caused all of the emissions that is causing the climate crisis. And maybe you can think about this, and I know that my use of the word capitalism, economists might get mad at me, but another way I'll explain this is, who has bought a phone within the last 2 years? Yeah? Okay, good number of people. And why do you buy phones so frequently? Why do you have to buy them every 2 years or so? Designing for obsolescence is something that is incentivized by capitalism. The more phones you sell, the more money you make. But the more phones you produce, the more phones you sell, that's more that you're extracting from the environment. And this too creates inequities. And I'll wrap up by pointing out that all of the technologies that are required for energy transition, I think that we're going to succeed in creating it. There have been some great incentives in the United States that have been pushing us towards technology development and deployment. But I think when we succeed in deploying these technologies, we're going to miss out on what is all the extraction that we're going to have to do to create those technologies. Lithium, there's salt flats in Chile.